I had always believed the aliens' greatest weapon was their technology, but I was wrong. Their true power lay in the way they bent our laws, our institutions, our very bureaucracy to their will. They didn't need to fire a single shot, they rewrote the rules of our world until we were trapped inside them. That realization came to me late one night, hunched over a stack of dusty municipal records when I discovered the clause buried in a forgotten treaty that gave them authority to seize land without compensation. It wasn't just a loophole, it was the cornerstone of their dominion, and if I could unravel it, I could make their empire collapse from the inside. I began small, slipping into government offices disguised as a clerk, memorizing the rhythm of their routines. Every alien directive had to pass through human intermediaries, and those intermediaries were drowning in paperwork. I learned to mimic their signatures, to shuffle files so that critical approvals vanished into the labyrinth of bureaucracy. A single misplaced form could delay an alien project for months, and I made sure those delays multiplied. They thought themselves untouchable, but they had never faced the quiet sabotage of a mind willing to weaponize red tape. The deeper I dug, the more I realized their arrogance blinded them. They had assumed no human would ever notice the contradictions in their legal framework, but I noticed. I traced their authority back to a single document filed decades ago, a document that required annual renewal. They had forgot to renew it. That meant technically their entire occupation was illegal. The discovery made my hands tremble. I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a spy trained in shadows, I was just an ordinary mind staring at the crack in their armor. I knew exposing this secret wouldn't be enough. If I simply revealed it, they would silence me before the truth spread, so I crafted a strategy of psychological warfare. I leaked fragments of the truth into their own ranks, planting doubts among the human collaborators who enforced alien orders. A whispered rumor here, a forged memo there, until paranoia began to bloom. Officials started questioning whether they were complicit in crimes that could one day be prosecuted. Fear spread faster than any weapon. The aliens noticed the unrest, but they couldn't trace it back to me. I was invisible, hidden in plain sight among the endless corridors of bureaucracy. And as their grip weakened, I felt the first stirrings of hope. Earth didn't need to fight them with guns or fleets, it needed to fight them with intelligence, with the very systems they had twisted against us. I had shattered their darkest secret, and now the question was how far I could push before they realized the war had already begun. The coded slip of paper under my cubicle door that night was printed on the back of a rejected rezoning application. The alien glyph watermark searing a faint purple imprint into the cheap pulp that made my stomach twist for half a second before I recognized the smudge of navy ink I'd taught Mara to use 3 weeks prior. She was a 19-year-old file clerk in the Alien Occupation's legal liaison office, the kid whose brother had been detained for printing anti-occupation leaflets 6 months back, the one I'd slipped a blank transit pass for when I found her crying in the supply closet after her shift. Her note didn't have words, just a string of numbers that matched the case file number for the unrenewed treaty clause, and a single line scrawled in the margin: "They're auditing the land seizure records next week." My throat went dry. The audit wasn't random. I'd planted a forged compliance risk memo on a junior alien administrator 2 weeks prior, the one that suggested unaccounted land seizures could trigger a review from the high command. I'd wanted them to poke at the cracks in their system, just not this soon, not before I'd copied every page of the original 1978 founding treaty, the one with the missing annual renewal stamp, the one I'd hidden in a hollowed-out volume of 1990s municipal zoning codes in my studio apartment. But if they audited the records first, they'd find the gap in the renewal timeline, blame it on negligent human file clerks, fast-track a retroactive renewal signed by a dozen alien administrators who'd never even read the original text, and lock the entire deep archive behind biometric locks only their species could access. All the slow rot I'd been sowing into their administrative machinery, all the quiet sabotage that had already delayed 3 major resource extraction projects by 8 months total, would be erased in a week. I needed the original treaty in my hands before the audit team set foot in the records basement. The problem was my access badge only cleared me for the 3rd-floor zoning processing center, nowhere near the climate-controlled deep archive where the 1978 treaty was stored, a room only senior human archivists and alien oversight officials could enter. The senior archivist, a man named Henderson who'd collaborated with the occupation for 12 years to keep his daughter's cancer treatments covered, was the only human with regular access, and I'd spent the last month seeding whispers among the lower-tier archive staff that Henderson was on the verge of being purged for mishandling sensitive land seizure documentation. He was already paranoid, already half convinced that if he found any discrepancy in the old records, he'd be the one held responsible. I pulled up the Alien Administrator directory I'd hacked 3 months back, scrolling to the signature of Kael'th Vorn, the mid-level oversight official who'd signed off on the last round of land seizures in the Eastern District, the one whose signature I'd practiced copying until the jagged alien glyphs looked like my own handwriting. I printed a forged directive on the official occupation letterhead I'd stolen from a recycling bin last month. The order clear. All records related to 1978 treaty land seizure provisions were to be pulled from the Deep Archive and compiled for pre-audit review within 48 hours, signed by Vorn, stamped with the fake oversight seal I'd carved out of a discarded plastic ID badge last week. I slipped it under the door of the archive's human staff entrance at 2 a.m. when the night shift clerk was halfway through her third coffee break, no cameras pointed at the door gap. By 10 a.m. the next day, Henderson was in the Deep Archive, pulling the 1978 treaty files. I waited 3 hours, then slipped down to the third-floor supply closet that connected to the archive's internal pneumatic tube system, the one the human staff used to send requests for file copies up to the processing centers. I'd already hacked the tube routing codes last month, when I was delaying the alien resource permits, so I could redirect any package sent from the archive to the supply closet instead of the third-floor intake desk. When the tube whooshed 20 minutes later, I pulled out the padded envelope. Inside was the original 1978 treaty, the missing renewal stamp glaringly absent from the bottom of the final page, and a handwritten note from Henderson scrawled on the back of the discrepancy report form he'd filled out. Found this. Don't know what to do. They'll kill me if they find out I pulled it. I didn't have time to reassure him. I tucked the treaty into the lining of my work jacket, slipped out of the supply closet, and walked straight to the back room of the independent bookstore on 5th that doubled as the Underground Press's headquarters. The editor, a former investigative reporter named Leela who'd gone dark when the aliens shut down every major news outlet on day 3 of the occupation, took one look at the treaty and didn't ask questions. She had the full text transcribed, verified against the copies I'd made of the other pages, and broadcast on the pirate radio frequencies we'd been using to spread the rumor fragments for the last 6 months, interspersed with the audio of Henderson's shaky voice reading the discrepancy report aloud, his face blurred in the grainy video we shot of him filling out the form in the archive. By sundown, the news was everywhere. The alien administration tried to shut down the radio frequencies, but we'd built a decentralized mesh network months back, when we were testing how to spread information without a central hub that could be seized. The collaborators manning the street checkpoints started asking their superiors why they were being ordered to seize land that the aliens had no legal right to take. The High Command called an emergency press conference to deny the claims, but when a reporter asked why the 1978 treaty renewal was missing from the public record, the alien spokesperson froze, then cut the feed mid-sentence. I walked home that night with the fake Vorn directive stuffed in my pocket, the one I used to trick Henderson, ready to burn it if the aliens came knocking. But as I passed the group of teenagers tagging a wall with the alien occupation insignia crossed out, one of them looked up and grinned, holding up a portable radio playing the pirate broadcast. For the first time since the ships had appeared over every major city on Earth, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like the first domino had fallen. The next morning, the city felt different. The checkpoints were still there, the patrols still marched, but the rhythm was off. The aliens had built their control on the illusion of inevitability, and now that illusion had cracked. I could see it in the way the clerks at the municipal office whispered to each other before stamping permits, in the way the translators hesitated before repeating alien directives in English. They were wondering if they'd been enforcing a lie all along. I knew the treaty alone wouldn't topple them. Bureaucracy was their chosen battlefield and they had centuries of practice, but bureaucracy cuts both ways. If the treaty was invalid, every seizure order, every property claim, every deportation notice could be challenged. And humans, ordinary humans, were suddenly armed with the most dangerous weapon imaginable, paperwork. I spent the day drafting appeals, filing them under pseudonyms, flooding the alien courts with contradictions. Henderson's voice echoed in my head as I wrote, "They'll kill me if they find out." Maybe they would. But if enough of us buried them under their own rules, they'd choke before they could silence us all. Leela coordinated the press to publish guides on how to file disputes, how to demand hearings, how to insist on signatures that no alien could legally provide. The mesh network carried not just rumors now, but instructions, step-by-step sabotage disguised as compliance. By evening, I heard the first reports. A deportation halted because the renewal stamp was missing. A land seizure delayed because the alien officer couldn't produce the required affidavit. Small victories, but they spread like sparks in dry grass. The aliens had built their empire on the assumption that humans would never read the fine print. Now the fine print was our battlefield. Walking home, I passed the same wall where the teenagers had tagged the insignia. This time, they weren't just painting over symbols, they were pasting copies of the treaty itself, page by page, daring the patrols to tear them down. One of the kids caught my eye and said, "They can't erase paper, can they?" I didn't answer. I just kept walking, the weight of the treaty pressing against my chest, heavier than any weapon, sharper than any blade. For the first time I believed we might actually win, not with guns, not with armies, but with the ordinary mind's refusal to be tricked. The kid's question hung in the air long after I turned the corner, sharp enough to cut through the hum of the alien patrol drones buzzing overhead. I didn't answer because I didn't have to. Paper doesn't care if you tell it to go away. It stays, it multiplies, it waits. My apartment door was unlocked when I got there, and Leela was sprawled on the floor surrounded by stacks of printed treaty pages, her laptop propped open on a crate of appeal forms, screen glowing with the alien administrative portal she'd spent 3 weeks reverse engineering. The second I stepped inside, she held up a sheaf of stamped papers, the red alien ink smudged in places where someone had pressed too hard. "First batch of rejections came through," she said, tapping the top form with a pen. "Every single one cites invalid species classification entry. Can you guess what that means?" I shook my head, the crinkle of the treaty tucked in my jacket pocket pressing against my chest through the fabric, just as sharp as it had been when I walked past the tagged wall. I'd carried it all day, half expecting the aliens to snatch it out of my hands, but no one had even looked twice. "They never published the official species classification code for humans," she said, grinning so wide her cheeks looked sore. "Their own administrative rules require any petitioner to list a valid code from the Interstellar Registry. We put Homo sapiens, which is correct, but they never released the corresponding 12-digit code for our species to the public. That means every rejection they just issued is legally void. They can't enforce a rule they didn't make publicly available. We can refile every single one and they can't turn us down without breaking their own due process standards." Before I could respond, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the door. Leela's hand flew to the baseball bat she kept behind the couch, but I waved her off. When I opened it, Henderson was standing there, his janitorial uniform rumpled, his face gray under the flickering hall light, clutching a crumpled alien data chip so tight his knuckles were white. He'd been the quiet file clerk at the municipal admin office, the one who'd told me a week earlier he was too scared to help, who'd said they'd erase his entire family's records if they found out he was talking to us. He didn't say anything at first, just held out the chip. "They were gonna shred it," he said, his voice so quiet I almost couldn't hear it over the drone hum outside. "I pulled it from the bin right before they dumped the load. It's the full internal classification registry. Look up code 774B. I plugged the chip into Leela's laptop, and the screen filled with rows of alien text and number strings, translated in real time by the Mesh Network's open-source parser. There it was, plain as day. 774B Homo sapiens designation, non-sentient agricultural labor asset, no standing to petition for judicial review under interstellar sentient species accords. Leela went very still. "They've been lying to their own oversight councils this whole time," she said slowly. "If we attach this to every pending appeal, we don't just win the deportations and the land seizures. We force them to either admit they've been enslaving a sentient species in violation of their own laws, or they have to grant us full legal standing overnight. Either way, their entire control structure collapses. They can't pretend we're not people if their own files say we're assets they're exploiting." Henderson flinched like he'd been hit. "They'll kill me for this," he said, but he didn't move to take the chip back. "My sister's deportation hearing is next week, if this works." "It'll work," I said, and I meant it. For months we'd thought the aliens' power came from their ships, their weapons, their ability to make us feel small and powerless. But it didn't. It came from the assumption that we'd never dig through the fine print, never ask to see the code they used to erase us, never think to use their own obsession with rules against them. I thought of the teenagers pasting treaty pages to the wall earlier, of the clerk who'd hesitated before stamping that deportation order, of Henderson, who'd risked everything to pull a crumpled chip out of a shredder bin. We didn't need to fire a shot. We just needed to make them follow the rules they wrote to keep us down. By midnight, we'd attached the classification registry to 17,000 pending appeals, and the first response came through 10 minutes later. The Alien Administrative Court had issued an emergency stay on all pending deportations, pending review of petitioner standing. The Mesh Network lit up with cheers I could hear through the window, from the encampments downtown, from the neighborhoods where people had been hiding for months, too scared to speak up. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the alien patrols still marching, still holding their weapons but moving slower now, confused. They thought their power was invincible. They forgot that the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't a ship or a laser. It's a human being who's tired of being lied to, who's willing to read the fine print, who's not afraid to make them eat their own rules. Somewhere down the street, someone started chanting the first line of the treaty, loud enough to carry over the drone hum. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, the treaty paper crinkling against my chest, and for the first time since the ships landed, I didn't feel afraid. I felt like the second domino had just started to fall. The stay order spread faster than any broadcast the aliens had ever issued. By dawn, every tribunal clerk had a copy of the registry, every defense advocate was citing it, and every alien magistrate was suddenly aware that their own bureaucracy had been weaponized against them. I could almost taste their panic in the way patrols doubled back, in the way their translators stuttered when asked simple questions. They weren't used to being challenged with their own words. I spent the morning in the courthouse basement, watching Henderson's sister walk free after the magistrate muttered something about pending clarification of species designation. The alien's voice shook, not from pity, but from the realization that the precedent had been set. One case was enough. The rest would follow like floodwater through a cracked dam. The real battle wasn't in the streets, it was in the filing rooms, the appeals offices, the endless stacks of paper and digital records they thought no human would ever bother to read. We had volunteers working in shifts, combing through every clause, every footnote, every procedural loophole. The aliens had built their empire on the assumption that humans were too chaotic to master bureaucracy. They didn't understand that chaos is just another word for creativity, and creativity thrives in the margins of rules. By noon, the first alien envoy stormed into the courthouse demanding an emergency override. But overrides required signatures from 3 separate councils, each bound by the same treaty language we'd unearthed. Watching them argue with themselves was like watching a snake try to swallow its own tail. Every word they spoke tightened the knot. I leaned against the wall, exhausted but exhilarated, listening to the chants outside swell into something that sounded less like protest and more like a hymn. For the first time, the aliens looked small. Not because we had outgunned them, but because we had outthought them. Their laws were their fortress, and we had found the cracks in the stone. All we had to do now was keep pressing until the whole structure collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. I remember the exact moment the magistrate's translator froze mid-sentence, its synthetic voice caught between 2 contradictory clauses. The silence that followed was heavier than any weapon they carried. We had forced them to confront the one thing they couldn't overpower, their own rules. I slipped into the records office while the magistrate sputtered, my heart pounding as if I were sprinting, though all I did was shuffle papers. Henderson's sister wasn't the only one who had walked free that morning, she was just the first domino. The rest were lined up neatly in the archives, waiting for the right push. The aliens had designed their bureaucracy to be impenetrable, a labyrinth meant to keep humans confused and compliant, but they underestimated how stubborn we could be when cornered. I found myself staring at a clause buried in the annex of the treaty, one that defined sentient species in terms so vague it could apply to half the animals in the city zoo. If we filed the right petitions, we could force them to prove, legally, that humans qualified under their own definition. The irony was delicious. The overlords would have to argue for our humanity in their own courts. By evening, the courthouse was a battlefield of whispers and paper shuffling. Volunteers carried stacks of filings like ammunition, each stamped with the seal that made them undeniable. The aliens tried to dismiss us as irrelevant, but every dismissal required a hearing, every hearing required documentation, and every document was another chance to twist the knife. Their empire wasn't collapsing from rebellion in the streets, it was drowning in its own paperwork. I watched one of their envoys, tall and glistening under the fluorescent lights, slam a clawed hand against the desk in frustration. The clerk didn't flinch. She simply slid another form across the counter and asked for the envoy's signature. That was the moment I realized we weren't just resisting, we were winning. Not with guns, not with fire, but with ink and patience. Every chant outside was a reminder that the fortress was cracking, and every clause we unearthed was another hammer strike against the walls. I pressed my palm against the treaty again, feeling the crinkle of paper like a pulse beneath my skin. Somewhere in those endless lines of alien legalese was the secret that would undo them completely. I didn't know yet which clause would be the final blow, but I knew it was there, waiting. And when we found it, the overlords wouldn't fall with a roar, they would collapse with a whisper, undone by the very words they thought would bind us forever. The discovery gnawed at me all night, the words of the clause echoing in my head like a riddle begging to be solved. By dawn, I was back in the archives, tracing the footnotes that led to older treaties, older empires the overlords had swallowed whole. Each annex was a fossil of their conquests, and buried in those fossils were contradictions sharp enough to cut them open. They had defined sentient so broadly in one treaty that even the insects they crushed underfoot might qualify, yet in another they had narrowed it so tightly that half their own vassal species would fail the test. The inconsistency was a weapon, and I was learning how to wield it. I began drafting petitions that forced them to reconcile these contradictions. Every time they tried to dismiss us, we countered with their own precedents. It was like watching a giant trip over its own legs. The magistrates grew restless, their voices cracking as they tried to explain away centuries of sloppy legal engineering. And the more they spoke, the more tangled they became. We didn't need to shout, we only needed to listen, record, and file. Their arrogance was writing our victory for us. Outside, the crowds had shifted from despair to a kind of hushed anticipation. People no longer looked at the courthouse as a place of punishment, but as a theater where the Overlord's mask was slipping. Henderson's sister stood among them, her freedom a living symbol of what ink and persistence could achieve. Every freed prisoner was another story whispered through the streets, another spark in the growing fire of belief. We weren't rebels anymore, we were litigants, archivists, clerks, and witnesses, and somehow that was more dangerous than any army. The breakthrough came when I noticed a clause requiring the overlords to maintain cultural integrity of any species under their governance. It was meant as a hollow gesture, a way to pacify conquered worlds, but it was binding nonetheless. If they denied our sentience, they would also have to admit they had violated their own law by erasing our languages, our rituals, our histories. The contradiction was fatal. Either we were sentient and deserved rights, or they were guilty of crimes against their own code. There was no third option. I remember the envoy's face when we presented that petition. The fluorescent lights caught the sheen of its carapace, but beneath the polished exterior was panic. It signed the form with a trembling claw, knowing that every signature was another chain tightening around its empire. And in that moment I understood the true power of ordinary minds, not to fight with weapons but to turn the Overlord's own words into shackles. The secret was no longer hidden, it was unraveling in plain sight, and all we had to do was keep pulling the thread. The petition spread like wildfire through the channels we had carved into their bureaucracy. Every clerk who touched it left a trace, every magistrate who signed it left a scar. I could feel the empire bleeding from paper cuts, each one small but cumulative, each one a reminder that their fortress was built on contradictions. They had thought law was a leash, but it was turning into a noose. I began to notice subtle shifts in their posture. The overlords no longer strode into hearings with the same swagger. They hesitated, glanced at each other, whispered in tones that betrayed uncertainty. They were creatures of dominance, but dominance requires certainty, and we had stolen that from them. Even their translators faltered, tripping over words that suddenly carried unintended meanings. Every mistranslation was another crack in their facade, another moment when the crowd outside laughed instead of cowered. The real victory, though, was psychological. People started filing their own petitions, ordinary citizens who had never seen themselves as warriors. A baker argued that the destruction of ovens violated cultural integrity. A teacher demanded restitution for banned textbooks. A child barely old enough to write submitted a complaint about the erasure of playground songs. Each case was trivial on its own, but together they became a chorus of defiance, a reminder that the overlords had underestimated the resilience of ordinary minds. I realized then that espionage didn't always mean shadows and disguises. It could mean slipping into their archives not to steal secrets but to expose them. We uncovered forgotten treaties, obscure rulings, and contradictory decrees buried under centuries of dust. Every discovery was a weapon, sharper than any blade, and when we presented them, the overlords had no choice but to acknowledge their own words. They were trapped in a cage they had built themselves, and we were the ones holding the key. The secret was no longer theirs to guard. It was ours to wield, and with every petition, every contradiction, every laugh from the crowd outside, the empire's grip loosened. I could feel the tide turning, not with explosions or armies, but with ink, memory, and the quiet persistence of people who refused to be erased. 3 days after the playground song petition landed on High Magistrate Kale's desk, they sent a squad of enforcers to the tenement where 7-year-old Leela lived, the girl who'd scrawled her grievance in crayon on the back of a ration slip. I was already inside the building, tucked in the maintenance crawlspace above her family's unit. The worn copy of the 217th Pre-Invasion Cultural Protection Accords I'd pulled from the buried archive stack pressed to my chest, my recorder running on silent. The enforcers kicked the door in before Leela could even finish her morning toast, demanding she withdraw the petition, calling it a frivolous waste of imperial resources that would earn her family a ration cut if she didn't comply. Leela just stared at them, clutching the crayon drawing of her and her friends singing the old playground rhyme she'd tucked into her pocket, and said she wouldn't because the song was hers. I dropped out of the crawlspace then, landing soft on the threadbare rug between them and the door, and held up the accords, flipping to the dog-eared page where Article 12, Section 4 was underlined in red marker. Under this treaty, signed by your own empire before the invasion to secure access to pre-invasion agricultural land, any dismissal of a minor's cultural grievance without a community-appointed guardian ad litem, and a public hearing carries a 12-month suspension for the issuing magistrate, plus forfeiture of 30% of their household stipend. The enforcers who carry out an illegal dismissal face the same penalty, plus reassignment to the waste reclamation colonies on the southern fringe. The lead enforcer froze, his hand hovering over the stun baton at his belt. He knew the rule: every Imperial employee was required to pass a basic treaty law exam within their first 6 months of service, even if their superiors pretended the old accords didn't exist. The crowd we tipped off had already gathered outside the tenement, their chants low and steady, reciting the article number over and over, no jeers, no stones, just the sound of 100 voices repeating our words back to us. The enforcers backed out 10 minutes later, empty-handed, and the magistrate's office sent a terse memo that afternoon saying Leela's case would be scheduled for a full hearing within the standard 90-day window. That was the first time I saw the Overlord's certainty crack so wide I could see the gears grinding behind their blank, scaled faces. They thought we'd fold the second they showed up with force, but we'd turn their own rules into a wall they couldn't climb over without hurting themselves. By the end of the week, we had the next trap set. One of our deep cover assets, a mid-level clerk in the Imperial Courts Records Office who'd been slipping us redacted copies of private magistrate memos for 3 months, sent over a note about a forgotten quorum requirement buried in the 209th Imperial Administrative Code. Any ruling that impacts more than 500 distinct pre-invasion cultural entities requires a full quorum of 17 high magistrates to pass, or the ruling is automatically null and void, with all affected grievances reinstated and the court ordered to pay full reparations to every petitioner within 30 days. We decounted the day before. The baker's oven petition, the teacher's textbook case, Leela's playground song, plus the 11,997 other petitions ordinary people had filed in the 2 weeks since we launched the filing channel, each one listing a distinct cultural artifact, practice, or space as the subject of the grievance, totaled 12,041 distinct entities. We decrossed the threshold without anyone noticing, not even the overlords who'd written the quorum rule off as obsolete decades prior, after they'd seized power and stopped pretending they cared about the old treaties at all. We filed the motion for a summary ruling on all pending cultural petitions the next morning, citing the quorum requirement verbatim. The response from the court was immediate and panicked. 3 of the 17 high magistrate seats were empty, the magistrates who'd held them on mandatory sabbatical to reconnect with their homeworld's cultural traditions, a rule the overlords had never bothered to waive because they'd never needed a full quorum for any of their previous rulings, which they'd always pushed through with a simple majority. The overlord's private memos leaked to us by our clerk showed the split immediately. One faction argued they should just suspend the quorum rule, declare it invalid for public safety, and dismiss all the petitions in one go. The other faction pushed back hard, pointing out that if they invalidated one administrative rule for convenience, every lower court magistrate in the empire would start doing the same, throwing out tax edicts, labor codes, curfew rules, any law they didn't feel like enforcing that day. The first faction won the argument, but only barely, and the order to dismiss all petitions came with a catch. They had to publish the ruling publicly first, as required by Imperial transparency regulations. We were ready. The moment the ruling went up on the Imperial public notice boards, we printed 10,000 copies of the quorum requirement, stapled them to every copy of the ruling posted across the city, and distributed them to every news channel the overlords allowed to operate, citing the transparency rule they just invoked to publish the dismissal. The crowd outside the court building didn't riot. They just started laughing, loud and sharp, as magistrates scrambled to take the notices down, as translators fumbled over their lines when they tried to explain why a rule they'd enforced for 70 years was suddenly invalid for public safety. That night, I got a note slipped under the door of the safe house I was staying in. It was a crayon drawing, the same one Leela had made of her singing the playground song, but now she'd drawn a bunch of little stick figures in the crowd outside the court building, all holding up papers, all smiling. There was no note, just her name scrawled at the bottom in wobbly letters. I taped the drawing to the wall next to the stack of archived treaties, right next to the first petition we'd ever filed, the one the clerk had snuck into the docket 6 months prior, the one we'd thought would never get read. The overlords still thought we were fighting them with weapons, with riots, with hidden attacks. They didn't get it yet, we weren't fighting them at all. We were just making them follow the rules they'd written, the rules they'd forgotten they'd ever agreed to, the rules that were going to bring the whole thing down without us ever having to fire a shot. The overlords had always believed their bureaucracy was a fortress, a labyrinth so dense no human mind could navigate it. But the truth was simpler, their arrogance had blinded them. They thought rules were chains for us, not for them. That was the crack we kept widening, one petition, one citation, one footnote at a time. The next morning the imperial auditors arrived. They weren't soldiers, they weren't magistrates, they were accountants, pale and meticulous, with eyes that flickered like scanners. They had been dispatched to review procedural compliance, which meant they were supposed to clean up the mess the overlords had made by suspending the quorum rule. But the auditors weren't loyal to the overlords. They were loyal to the regulations themselves, to the endless scrolls of statutes and codes that defined their empire. And when they saw the contradictions stapled to every wall, they froze. I watched from the balcony as one auditor pulled out a stylus and began cross-referencing the ruling with the transparency regulation. His lips moved silently, tracing the words until he stopped and looked up at the magistrates with something I'd never seen before in their kind: doubt. That was the moment I knew we had them. Not because the auditors would side with us, they wouldn't, not openly, but because the overlords had forced their own enforcers to choose between loyalty to power and loyalty to the law. By noon the magistrates had ordered the notices burned, but the auditors had already logged them, filed them, archived them in the imperial record. Once entered, nothing could be erased without a full tribunal, and tribunals required quorums, the very quorum they had just declared invalid. That night I sat with the clerk in the dim light of the safe house, the crayon drawing still taped to the wall. He whispered that the auditors had sent a memo to the imperial capital, a memo that would trigger a review of every ruling made in the last 70 years. Every curfew, every tax, every labor code, all of it subject to challenge if the quorum rule was gone. The overlords had tried to silence us with a shortcut, but instead they had cut the foundation out from under their own empire. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about Leela's drawing, about the stick figures holding papers, smiling. They weren't warriors, they weren't rebels. They were just people who had learned to read the rules, to laugh at the contradictions, to hold up the empire's own words like mirrors until the overlords saw themselves reflected back. And I realized then we didn't need to win. We just needed to keep them playing by their own game until the game itself collapsed. The clerk's memo was a spark, but sparks alone don't burn empires. They need oxygen, and we had to make sure the overlords kept breathing the rules they had written. So I drafted a petition not to overturn the suspension, not to demand justice, but to request clarification. A single word: define quorum, define tribunal, define compliance. I knew the auditors couldn't resist. Their entire existence was built on definitions, on the precision of language. By the next week the imperial capital responded with a provisional directive. It was a masterpiece of contradictions. Tribunals required quorums, quorums required tribunals, and compliance required both. The overlords tried to bury it under layers of decrees, but the auditors had already distributed copies to every regional office. The empire's own bureaucracy had become our printing press. I carried one of those copies folded in my pocket like a talisman. When I walked through the checkpoints, I didn't hide it. I let the guards see the seal, the signature, the endless clauses looping back on themselves. They never stopped me. They didn't dare. To question the directive was to risk being accused of noncompliance, and noncompliance was punishable only by a tribunal. A tribunal that couldn't legally exist. That was our weapon: silence. We didn't shout, we didn't march, we didn't fight. We just kept asking questions the law couldn't answer. Every time they tried to enforce a curfew, someone filed a request for the tribunal's quorum definition. Every time they levied a tax, someone demanded the compliance citation. The overlords grew restless, their magistrates furious, but the auditors kept recording, filing, archiving. I began to see cracks in their faces, the overlords themselves. They were creatures of dominance, not patience. They thrived on fear, not paperwork. And now they were drowning in their own statutes, forced to argue with clerks and auditors instead of crushing us with soldiers. One evening as I walked past the old courthouse, I saw a group of children playing with scraps of paper. They weren't pretending to be warriors or rebels. They were pretending to be auditors, stamping each other's petitions, laughing at the absurdity of rules that contradicted themselves. That was when I understood. The empire wasn't collapsing because we were strong. It was collapsing because we had made its own rules ridiculous, and ridicule was something even their darkest secret couldn't withstand. The secret wasn't hidden in their weapons or their armies. It was hidden in their obsession with order, with the illusion that law could be bent without breaking. And now, every ordinary mind that read a clause, every child who laughed at a petition, was shattering that illusion piece by piece. I slipped the folded directive into the inner lining of my coat and made my way toward the Hall of Records, the towering spire where the overlords kept the master codices that governed every sector of their rule. The building hummed with a low, resonant frequency. Something I had learned was the auditory signature of their compliance matrix, a lattice of light and sound that constantly cross-checked every edict against the next. To the untrained ear it sounded like distant wind. To an auditor it was the heartbeat of an empire that believed its laws were infallible. I paused at the marble steps, feeling the weight of the paper against my chest. The children's game earlier had shown me that absurdity could be contagious, but I needed something more focused, a single point where the paradox could be forced to collapse inward, not just ripple outward. I recalled a fragment from an old human legal treatise I had once smuggled into the archive, the concept of ultra vires, an act beyond the powers granted by law. If I could get the overlords to admit that one of their own decrees was ultra vires, the very foundation of their authority would tremble. The hall's interior was a maze of translucent corridors, each wall etched with flowing script that shifted as you watched, updating in real time as new directives were issued. I moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent weeks shadowing auditors, learning the cadence of their steps, the timing of their breaks, the subtle tells that indicated when a clerk was about to file a request. I slipped behind a column as a pair of overseers glided past, their robes shimmering with the insignia of the Tribunal Council. Their eyes scanned the corridors, not for rebels but for any deviation from the expected flow of paperwork. Reaching the central chamber, I found the archivist, a tall, gaunt figure whose limbs seemed assembled from jointed plates of obsidian, each movement accompanied by a faint chime. Before him floated a holographic display of the Codex Prime, the original compendium from which all subsequent decrees were derived. Around him hovered a cadre of junior auditors, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of hovering data screens. I stepped forward, my voice calm but edged with the urgency that comes when you know you are dancing on a knife's edge. "Honored Archivist," I said, "I bring a petition for clarification under Section 7.3 of the Provisional Directive concerning the definition of definition itself." The archivist's obsidian head tilted, the chime rising in pitch. "Clarification is granted only when the subject matter is extant within the Codex." "State your reference?" I unfolded the copy from my pocket, the paper crisp despite the weeks of wear, and laid it on the levitating slab before him. The seal of the Imperial Council caught the light, a sigil of interlocking gears that the overlords claimed symbolized eternal order. I pointed to the clause that read, "A tribunal shall be considered valid only when a quorum of members as defined by the tribunal charter is present. A quorum shall be considered valid only when the tribunal is convened." A murmur rippled through the junior auditors. The archivist's chime faltered for a heartbeat, then resumed steadier. "The clause is self-referential. It requires external resolution." "Exactly," I replied, my voice steady. "If the definition of tribunal depends on quorum and the definition of quorum depends on tribunal, then neither can be established without the other. According to the principles of ultra vires, a decree that creates an impossible condition is beyond the authority that issued it." The archivist's obsidian surface flickered, a cascade of micro-reflections racing across his form like static. For the first time I saw something akin to uncertainty in his posture, a slight hesitation in the tilt of his head, a dimming of the chime that usually resonated with absolute certainty. "Your argument is logical," he said, each word emerging with a deliberate cadence as if testing the weight of the syllables. "But the Codex contains safeguards against paradox. Subroutine Sigma 9 will resolve inconsistencies through recursive validation." I had anticipated this. The auditors had whispered about Sigma 9, a hidden protocol designed to ingest contradictions and output a harmonized ruling by iterating through layers of precedent until a stable state emerged. It was the Empire's safety net, a way to absorb the very absurdities we were weaponizing. But safety nets have limits, they depend on finite processing cycles and a bounded set of axioms. I reached into my coat and produced a second slip of paper, this one blank except for a single line I had copied from an old human logbook. "This statement is false." I placed it beside the directive. The archivist's chime-stilled chime spiked, a sharp discord that made the holographic codex shudder. The junior auditors stared, their own data screens flickering as they tried to parse the liar paradox layered atop the existing circular definition. Sigma 9 engaged, its invisible threads of light spiraling outward from the archive's core, attempting to reconcile the new input. Seconds stretched. The hall's ambient hum grew uneven, the resonant frequency wavering as if the very fabric of the compliance matrix was being tugged in opposite directions. I could see the archive's obsidian plate subtly shifting, micro-fractures appearing along the seams where his segments joined. Then, with a sound like a crystal glass shattering under pressure, the holographic Codex Prime collapsed into a cascade of fragmented glyphs that scattered across the floor like ash. The chime fell silent, replaced by a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, the sound of a system straining beyond its design limits. The junior auditors gasped, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. One of them, a young woman with trembling hands, stepped forward and whispered, "Though the definition of definition, it's undefined." I felt a surge of triumph, but also a sobering realization. We had not destroyed the overlords, we had exposed a flaw in the architecture of their control. The Empire's strength lay in its belief that law could be made absolute. Now that belief was cracked, and cracks, once begun, tend to widen. The archive's obsidian form dimmed, the chime returning in a hesitant, uneven rhythm. "Error detected, recalibrating," he intoned, the words slower, each syllable weighed down by the effort of processing an inconsistency that refused to resolve. I slipped the blank paper back into my coat, the paradox still humming in my mind like a secret chord. Around me, the auditors began to move not in panic but with purpose. They started filing requests for definitions of every term they could think of: law, order, authority, compliance. Each request fed the system another loop, another thread of uncertainty pulling at the fabric of the Overlord's rule. Outside the hall, the city's sky seemed to hold its breath. The overseers' patrols slowed, their steps less certain as they glanced at the accumulating petitions fluttering from citizens' hands like snowflakes. Children continued their games, now stamping not just petitions but entire sheets of paper with the sigil of the question mark, their laughter ringing louder than before. I walked back through the corridors, the weight of the directive lighter now replaced by the quiet certainty that we had struck at the heart of their power, not with weapons, but with the very thing they revered most, the illusion of infallible law. The Overlord's darkest secret was not a weapon hidden in a vault, it was their reliance on a self-contained logical universe that could be made to doubt itself. And once doubt entered, even the most rigid order began to fray. As I emerged into the twilight, the first stars blinked awake above the city, indifferent to the machinations of empires below. I tucked my hands into my pockets, feeling the edge of the petition paper against my fingertips, and thought of the children still playing, their innocent game now a quiet revolution. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the invaders arrived, I sensed a shift, not in the balance of force but in the balance of belief. And belief once shaken could be reshaped.